the man who walked into a bar and vanished. At around 1:55 in the morning, a 27-year-old medical student was caught on surveillance footage outside a bar in Columbus, Ohio. He was talking to two women. He appeared completely normal. Then, he turned and headed back toward the entrance. And that was the last confirmed image anyone has of him. Brian Shaffer was never seen again. No confirmed sighting. No confirmed departure. And nearly 2 decades later, investigators still don't know what happened to him. The strangest part? Police had surveillance cameras around the building. But somehow, there is no confirmed footage showing Brian leaving. So how does a man disappear from a crowded bar without anyone seeing him walk out? A promising future. Brian Randall Shaffer was born in 1979 and grew up near Columbus, Ohio. By 2006, he was 27 years old and studying medicine at Ohio State University. He had already earned a degree in microbiology from Ohio State and was pursuing his medical career. According to the FBI, Brian was also a musician who played guitar. He was approximately 6 feet 2 inches, weighed around 160 to 165 pounds, had brown hair and hazel eyes, and had a distinctive Pearl Jam tattoo on his upper right arm. To the people around him, Brian had a future, medical school, a girlfriend, friends, family, and plans for the coming days. There was nothing publicly known that suggested he intended to simply disappear. The night before spring break, it was the beginning of April 2006. Brian had been studying intensely for his medical school exams. Spring break was approaching, and he had plans to travel to Miami with his girlfriend. But on the night of March 31st, Brian decided to go out with friends. Earlier that evening, he had spent time with his father. Later, he met up with his friend Clint Florence. Eventually, another friend, Meredith Reed, joined them. The group spent part of the night visiting bars around Ohio State's campus. Eventually, they returned to a place called the Ugly Tuna Saloona, and that decision would become the center of one of America's strangest missing person cases. The Ugly Tuna Saloona. The Ugly Tuna Saloona was located near Ohio State University's campus in Columbus. It was a busy college bar. That night, people were coming and going. Music was playing, friends were drinking, and security cameras were operating around the building. At approximately 1:15 a.m., surveillance footage captured Brian and his friends approaching the bar. According to the Columbus Police case summary, Brian was seen outside the bar again at approximately 1:55 a.m. At that point, nothing seemed extraordinary. Brian was simply another customer at a busy bar. But within minutes, he would become a missing person. And here's where the story becomes almost impossible to explain. Because the cameras didn't simply fail to capture Brian. They captured him before he disappeared. And then, nothing. The final images. Around 1:55 a.m., Brian was seen outside the bar's entrance area talking with two women. The footage shows him near the entrance. He then moved back toward the bar. That became his last confirmed sighting. According to the Columbus Police case summary, Brian's friends later left the bar and waited outside for him. But Brian never appeared. At first, they apparently assumed he had already gone. Perhaps he had walked home. Perhaps he had left through another route. Perhaps he would simply meet them later. But Brian didn't return home. And he didn't show up for his planned trip. The missed flight. Brian was scheduled to leave for Miami with his girlfriend on April 3rd. But he never made it to the airport. His phone calls went unanswered. His family became increasingly concerned. And soon, the possibility that Brian had simply gone somewhere on his own became much harder to accept. A missing person investigation began. Police reviewed the cameras. Investigators returned to the Ugly Tuna Saloona. They reviewed surveillance footage. They retraced Brian's movements. And they looked carefully at the entrances and exits. According to the Columbus Police case summary, Brian was not seen on CCTV leaving through the bar's main exit. No one who was at the bar that night reported seeing him leave. That immediately created the central mystery. If Brian didn't leave through the main entrance, where did he go? But there was an important detail that many retellings of this case leave out. The building wasn't simply a box with one door. There were other possible routes, and investigators had to determine whether Brian could have left without appearing on the available footage. The other possibilities. The FBI and Columbus Police have never publicly established exactly how Brian disappeared. One possibility investigated involved a service entrance that wasn't used by ordinary customers. There was also a construction area connected to the building at the time, and some cameras had limitations or blind spots. That means the famous phrase, "Brian walked into the bar and never walked out," is a compelling description of the mystery. But it should not be interpreted as proof that it was physically impossible for him to leave. The official case remains unresolved. Brian's current FBI listing still asks for information about his disappearance. The search begins. Once Brian was reported missing, investigators searched the area surrounding the bar. They examined possible routes away from the building. They looked at nearby locations. They interviewed witnesses. And they searched for any evidence that could explain what happened after Brian's final confirmed sighting. But no definitive answer emerged. No confirmed sighting after that night. No clear explanation. No body. No verified evidence establishing where Brian went. A family left waiting. For Brian's family, the mystery became a painful reality. Years passed. Then more years. Friends graduated. Buildings changed. The bar eventually disappeared from the location. But Brian's family continued waiting for answers. The Ohio Attorney General's Bureau of Criminal Investigation and Columbus Police later released an age-progressed image showing what Brian might look like today. The purpose was simple. Someone might know something. Someone might remember something. And perhaps one piece of information could finally explain what happened. The question that remains. Almost 2 decades later, the central question hasn't changed. Where did Brian Shaffer go after the last confirmed sighting? Did he leave through a route investigators couldn't document? Did something happen after he left the building? Was someone else involved? Or is there a piece of evidence that investigators still haven't found? We don't know. And that's precisely why this case continues to fascinate investigators, journalists, and the public. End of part 1. Brian entered the Ugly Tuna Saloona. Cameras captured him. His friends left. And then, Brian Shaffer vanished. But the strangest part of the investigation was still ahead. The investigation, the cameras, and the missing hours. Investigators had something most missing person cases don't have. Video. Brian Shaffer had been inside a busy college bar, and surveillance cameras had captured part of his final known movements. But instead of giving investigators an easy answer, the footage created an even bigger mystery. Because Brian was seen near the entrance, and then he was gone. No confirmed sighting after 1:55 a.m. No explanation, and no verified evidence showing what happened next. So investigators had to reconstruct one of the most important questions in the entire case. How could Brian disappear from a crowded area without leaving a confirmed trail? The last confirmed contact. According to the FBI, Brian's last known contact occurred at approximately 1:55 a.m. while he was drinking with friends at an Ohio State University area bar in Columbus. That timestamp became the dividing line in the investigation. Before it, Brian was alive and accounted for. After it, nothing was confirmed. And that gap is what has kept the case alive for nearly 2 decades. The surveillance footage. The surveillance footage became one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the case. Brian was seen around the bar during the early morning hours. He was also seen outside near the entrance shortly before his disappearance. But investigators could not establish a confirmed recording of Brian leaving through the main entrance. That fact has fueled one of the biggest questions surrounding the case. Did Brian leave through another route? Was there a blind spot? Did he leave the area without being noticed? Or did something happen to him before he could leave? The available evidence hasn't provided a definitive answer. And this is where the case becomes even more complicated. Because a missing person doesn't necessarily need to appear on a camera to leave a building. There can be blind spots, alternative exits, unrecorded movements, and human beings can simply fail to notice someone walking past them. So the absence of footage doesn't automatically prove Brian was still inside. But it also doesn't explain where he went. The possible exit. One of the major investigative questions involved the possibility that Brian could have left through a route that wasn't captured by the available surveillance. The building had other access points and areas that complicated the reconstruction of his movements. This is important because the popular version of the case sometimes makes the disappearance sound physically impossible. It wasn't necessarily that simple. Investigators had to consider every realistic possibility. If Brian left through another route, where did he go afterward? If he remained inside, how did he avoid being found? And if another person was involved, what evidence would prove it? The people with Brian. Brian hadn't been alone that night. He had gone out with friends. Those people became important witnesses because they could help establish his movements and state of mind before he disappeared. But investigators ultimately faced the same problem. The witnesses could describe what they remembered, yet no one could provide a confirmed explanation for what happened after Brian's final known contact. That distinction matters. A witness saying they saw Brian earlier in the night doesn't tell investigators what happened hours later. And in a case where minutes matter, even a small gap in the timeline can become enormous. The search. Once Brian was reported missing, authorities began searching for him. Investigators examined locations around Columbus and looked for evidence that could establish where he had gone. Friends and family also searched. The case received significant public attention. But despite the searches, no confirmed location was established. No definitive trail emerged, and Brian remained missing. Then came another painful reality. As the years passed, the physical world around the case changed. Buildings changed. People moved. Memories faded. Technology advanced. But Brian was still missing. The case doesn't disappear. One of the most important facts about Brian's case is that it hasn't simply been forgotten by law enforcement. The FBI still maintains an active missing person profile for Brian. The agency continues to ask anyone with information to contact law enforcement or the FBI. Brian's case is also listed through the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. That means that even after all these years, the possibility of new information remains. The age-progressed image. As the years passed, authorities also created an age-progressed image showing what Brian might look like later in life. The purpose was straightforward. Someone who remembers Brian from 2006 might not recognize him today. An age-progressed image gives the public another way to identify someone who may have seen him years ago. It's a reminder of something important about missing person investigations. Time doesn't necessarily end a case. Sometimes, it simply changes the kind of evidence investigators need. The theories. Over the years, countless theories have appeared online. Some suggest Brian voluntarily disappeared. Others believe he may have encountered someone after leaving the bar. Some theories focus heavily on the surveillance footage. Others point toward possible accidents or events that were never discovered. But none of these theories has been proven, and that's something your documentary should make absolutely clear. A theory is not evidence. The FBI's public profile does not provide a confirmed explanation for Brian's disappearance. Why the case still matters. Brian wasn't simply a name on a missing person poster. He was a medical student, a musician, a son, a brother, a friend, and a young man who appeared to have a future ahead of him. That's why the case remains so powerful. Behind every mystery, there is a person whose family is still waiting for an answer. The biggest question, nearly 20 years later, we can identify the last confirmed point in Brian's timeline. We know he was in Columbus. We know he was at the bar. We know his last known contact was around 1:55 a.m. And we know he was later reported missing. But the crucial question remains. What happened after 1:55 a.m.? That is the gap investigators have never been able to completely close. Maybe the answer is hidden somewhere in evidence that has already been collected. Maybe someone who knows something has never come forward. Or maybe an entirely new piece of information will one day change the investigation. Because after all these years, the FBI is still asking the same basic question. Where is Brian Shaffer? And until that question is answered, his disappearance remains one of the most enduring missing person mysteries in the United States. The theories, the evidence, and the question that remains. After nearly 2 decades, there is still no confirmed explanation for what happened to Brian Shaffer. The FBI continues to list him as missing, describing him as 27 years old at the time of his disappearance, a medical student and guitarist. The FBI's current profile identifies his last known contact as approximately 1:55 a.m. on April 1, 2006, at a bar near Ohio State University in Columbus. And that brings us to the hardest part of this story. What can we actually say happened, and what remains only theory? The voluntary disappearance theory. One possibility discussed over the years is that Brian may have intentionally disappeared. Perhaps he wanted to leave his old life behind. Perhaps he was under personal pressure. Or perhaps something happened in his life that nobody around him fully understood. But there is a major problem with this theory. Brian had plans. He was a medical student. He had a girlfriend. And he was expected to travel to Miami shortly after the night he disappeared. There is also no confirmed evidence publicly establishing that Brian planned to disappear. So while a voluntary disappearance cannot simply be imagined away, there is no official finding that Brian chose to vanish. The accident theory. Another possibility is that Brian left the area and experienced an accident. Columbus is a large city. There were roads, waterways, construction areas, and countless places where someone could potentially become difficult to locate. An accident could theoretically explain why there was no later confirmed contact. But again, there is a problem. No confirmed discovery has connected Brian to such an accident. And without physical evidence, the theory remains just that, a possibility. Then there is the theory that has kept true crime audiences debating for years. What if Brian never left the area voluntarily? The foul play theory. Some people believe Brian may have encountered another person after his last confirmed contact. That could mean an argument, a confrontation, or something more serious. But there is an important distinction between possibility and evidence. There has never been a publicly established perpetrator in Brian's disappearance. No person has been officially convicted for his disappearance. And the FBI continues to seek information rather than presenting a solved explanation. That means we cannot responsibly turn an online theory into a fact. The surveillance mystery. Perhaps the most famous element of Brian's case remains the surveillance footage. It is easy to look at the story and think, if cameras were there, how could someone disappear? But surveillance systems are not perfect. A camera records only what falls within its field of view. There can be entrances, exits, blind spots, obstructions, technical limitations, and moments when a person simply isn't captured. So the footage is extremely important. But it isn't a magical recording of every second of Brian's night. And that's why investigators still needed witnesses, physical evidence, timelines, and additional information. The passage of time. One of the greatest challenges in any long-term missing person investigation is time. 2006 feels like another world. Smartphones weren't nearly as ubiquitous. Social media was still in its early stages. Modern facial recognition technology wasn't what it is today, and memories naturally become less reliable as years pass. People move. Buildings are demolished. Businesses close. Records disappear. Potential witnesses grow older. Yet Brian's case remains in official databases. The FBI continues to request information, while Columbus Police maintains a missing persons unit responsible for investigating missing person cases. A face that has aged with time. There is another heartbreaking reality. The man shown in photographs from 2006 would not look exactly the same today. That's why age-progressed images have been used in missing person investigations. Someone who may have seen Brian years ago might encounter a person today who looks different enough that they wouldn't immediately make the connection. For Brian's family, that possibility matters. Because somewhere out there, someone may have information they don't realize is important. The question of evidence. This is where responsible true crime storytelling becomes important. There are hundreds of theories surrounding Brian Shaffer online. Some are fascinating. Some are disturbing. Some are extremely detailed. But unless investigators have confirmed them, they remain theories. And after almost 20 years, there is still no publicly established answer explaining exactly what happened to Brian. The FBI's current listing still asks people with information to come forward. Why this case still haunts people? Maybe it's because Brian wasn't disappearing from an isolated wilderness. He was in Columbus, Ohio, around other people, at a bar, during a normal night out. And yet, his trail appears to end. That's what makes the case so unsettling. A person can disappear without leaving behind the kind of evidence investigators hope for. And sometimes, the biggest mystery isn't finding the answer. It's determining which question should be asked first. The last known moment. Let's go back to the beginning. Brian was 27, a medical student, a guitarist, a son, a brother, a friend. On April 1st, 2006, he was out with friends near Ohio State University. At approximately 1:55 a.m., he was last known to be in contact with those around him. Then, the trail goes cold. Nearly 20 years later, there is still no confirmed account of what happened next. Could one person change everything? Cold cases can remain dormant for decades. Then one phone call changes everything. A forgotten photograph, an old message, a witness finally deciding to speak, a new forensic technique, or a person who suddenly realizes, I know something about that night. That's why authorities continue asking for information. Because sometimes, the smallest detail can become the missing piece. Clapperboard Final Chapter. Brian Shaffer disappeared almost 2 decades ago. His family has lived with uncertainty ever since. And while the internet has produced countless theories, the honest answer remains much simpler. We don't know what happened to Brian. We know when he was last confirmed to be in contact with people. We know where he was. We know he was reported missing. And we know that investigators have never publicly established a definitive explanation for his disappearance. Everything beyond that must be treated carefully. Because this isn't just an internet mystery. It's a real person. And somewhere behind every headline, there is a family still waiting for an answer. Maybe one day, someone will finally provide the information that explains Brian's disappearance. Until then, his case remains open to new information. If you found this story compelling, subscribe to the channel for more fact-based mysteries and true crime documentaries. And if you have a theory, remember to separate what is confirmed from what is speculation. Speech Balloon, what do you think happened to Brian Shaffer? Share your thoughts in the comments. But keep the discussion respectful and fact-based. And if someone watching this knows something about that night in Columbus, even something that seems insignificant, it could be worth telling investigators.